In Côte d'Ivoire, this harvest, an 11-year-old boy swings a machete almost as long as his own arm, splitting open a cocoa pod he will never see turned into chocolate. Those beans are headed into a supply chain worth more than $100 billion a year, into candy sold under names every one of us would recognize. In 2001, the largest chocolate companies on Earth signed a promise to end child labor exactly like his. By 2005, it is 2026. 3,000 years before that boy was born, people called this same plant something else. The food of the gods. They mixed it with human blood and gave it to people who were about to die. That was supposed to be ancient history, a strange and brutal thing safely behind glass. It isn't. To understand how we got here, we don't start in West Africa. We start on a jungle floor, with fruit rotting in the heat, long before anyone thought to call it sacred. Start in the Amazon basin, in what is now Ecuador, more than 5,000 years ago. Long before pyramids, before writing, a people archaeologists call the Mayo-Chinchipe were already cultivating a strange, thick-podded tree that grew low on the trunk, almost as if it didn't trust its own branches. We know this from an archaeological site called Santa Ana la Florida, where scientists later found starch grains, chemical traces of a compound called theobromine, and fragments of ancient DNA, all specific to one plant, Theobroma cacao. Crack one of those pods open, and there is no chocolate anywhere in sight. Instead, there's pulp, pale, slippery, almost citrus sweet, wrapped around bitter purple seeds nobody in their right mind would eat raw. For a long time, that pulp was probably the whole point. People sucked it off the seeds and spat the rest out, or fermented it into something like a mild, cloudy beer. Somewhere in that fermentation, likely by accident, someone noticed the seeds left behind, roasted, ground, bitter, in a way that got under the tongue and stayed there. The plant migrated north into Mesoamerica, carried hand to hand along trade routes older than any empire that would later claim it. By around 1500 BCE, the Macaya people on Mexico's Pacific coast and the Olmec along the Gulf were using cacao in a form recognizable as an early ancestor of chocolate. Theobromine residue turns up in their pottery at sites called Paso de la Armada and San Lorenzo. Linguists have traced the word itself, cacawa, back to Olmec speech, spoken as early as 1000 BCE. Later legend would say the tree came from paradise, stolen by a feathered serpent god and given to humanity against the other god's wishes. Nobody who first fermented that jungle pulp knew they were making myth. They were probably just hungry or bored or curious about something rotting a little differently than everything else on the forest floor. But once cacao reached the river towns and market squares of Mesoamerica, something shifted. It stopped being a fruit somebody happened to like. The tree itself was strange to look at, pods the size of a small football growing straight out of the trunk and old branches, ripening yellow, orange, and deep red, refusing to grow anywhere but the shade of taller trees. Bitter, dark, difficult to grow outside a narrow band of hot, shaded land, it had exactly the qualities that turn an ordinary plant into something people fight over. Scarcity, difficulty, a taste that has to be acquired, which means it can be gate-kept. The people who figured out how to grow it, ferment it, and turn it into a drink worth talking about were about to build an entire civilization's imagination around it. By the time Maya civilization was in full flower, cacao wasn't just valuable, it was holy. In the Madrid Codex, a sacred Mayan text, gods are shown piercing their own ears and letting blood fall onto cacao pods, mingling their own blood with the fruit. In the Popol Vuh, the great Mayan creation story, the body of a buried god gives rise to the first cacao tree, one of the foods the gods used to shape human beings out of nothing. Humans, by this account, are partly made of cacao. Centuries later, the Aztecs would treat the tree as untouchable, elevated far above ordinary food, and give the young man chosen to represent their god, Quetzalcoatl, a chocolate drink to fortify him through his final days. It was also unmistakably money. By the height of the Aztec Empire, 100 cacao beans bought a porter a full day's wages. 3 beans bought an egg or an avocado. 1 bean, a single ripe tomato. Merchants called posteca carried sacks of beans through hostile territory the way other cultures carried gold, organized into a dozen separate guilds with their own warehouses. Membership passed down like a title. By legend, Emperor Moctezuma kept a private storehouse holding close to 1 billion of them. The Codex Mendoza records exactly how the empire fed that hoard. 200 loads of cacao, 8,000 beans to a load, extracted twice a year as tribute from a single conquered province called Soconusco. That is over 3 million beans, paid on schedule, year after year, to a court that never grew a single cacao tree of its own. And yet, not everyone was allowed to drink it. Aztec law reserved chocolate for royalty, nobility, warriors, and the long-distance traders who risked their lives bringing it home. A commoner caught drinking it uninvited was not admired. He was suspected. Picture the drink itself, poured from vessel to vessel, again and again, to raise a thick, bitter foam, spiced with chili and vanilla, served cold, never sweet the way we'd recognize today. One Spanish chronicler would later claim Montezuma's own guard alone drank more than 2,000 cups of it in a single day. A civilization had built its money, its class system, and its gods around a single bitter bean. Word of a strange new world, and the wealth pouring out of it, was already crossing the ocean. Resistance to cacao came from 2 directions at once, and neither side saw the other coming. Inside the Aztec world, the resistance was already old news, a taboo enforced by law that kept this sacred plant out of common hands. Warriors could drink it, nobles could drink it. An ordinary farmer caught with a cup of it was suspected of theft or worse. Outside that world, resistance looked like plain contempt. In 1502, on his 4th voyage, Christopher Columbus's men intercepted a trading canoe loaded with strange brown beans, guarded by its Maya crew as if they carried gold. Columbus's men took one look and assumed the beans were worthless, shriveled almonds not worth the trouble of counting. Decades later, when Europeans finally tasted the drink itself, they weren't much kinder. The Italian traveler Girolamo Benzoni, among the first to describe it in writing, judged it a beverage more fit for pigs than for men. It was thick, it was bitter, it was spiced with chili instead of sugar, and it did not taste like anything a 16th century Spaniard wanted in his mouth. Meanwhile, Hernán Cortés was already marching toward Tenochtitlan. He landed in 1519. He allied with the Aztecs' oldest enemies, and in the summer of 1520, during a night the Spanish would call the Night of Sorrows, he lost nearly half his force trying to flee the city, soldiers so weighed down with looted gold that they sank in the causeway canals and drowned under its weight. He came back anyway. When he finally stood before Moctezuma, the emperor offered him the empire's most sacred hospitality, chocolate, foamed and poured in front of him. A gift from one kind of power to what Moctezuma may have believed was another kind of god entirely. Cortés did not recognize the gift for what it was. he saw a strange, bitter drink. Beneath it, he saw an empire's wealth, waiting to be counted and shipped home. By 1521, the argument over whether cacao was fit for men would stop mattering to anyone. The empire that had spent centuries deciding who deserved to drink it was weeks from ceasing to exist. Before the fall, one last picture of cacao at the height of its old power. Each year, by the widely repeated account handed down through Aztec ritual, a young man was chosen to spend 40 days living as the god Quetzalcoatl. He was dressed in fine clothes, fed the richest food in the empire, treated as something between royalty and a walking god. And near the very end, he was given a drink called Itzpacalatl, cacao, mixed with the water used to rinse obsidian blades that had already drawn blood in sacrifice. He drank it, then he danced, and then he died, believed to carry the god's favor with him into the next world. It happened again and again, year after year, right up until the year everything changed. Cortés's siege of Tenochtitlan began in 1519 and ended in 1521. Smallpox arrived with the Spanish and swept through a population with no defense against it, killing faster than any battle could. Starvation followed. The city that had run an empire on cacao tribute, on tightly counted sacks of 8,000 beans each, fell. Moctezuma's storehouses, the ones legend piled 1 billion beans high, were seized along with everything else. Here is the part that rarely gets said out loud. Spain did not destroy cacao's economy. It kept it. It simply changed who the tribute was for. The city fell. The tribute did not stop. It only changed hands. The same trade routes that had once funneled cacao toward temples and emperors were redirected, almost without missing a beat, toward Spanish ledgers instead. Fertile cacao land in places like Chontalpa, Tabasco, was seized outright by the newcomers. Indigenous labor, organized under a colonial system called the encomienda, kept growing the same bean, on the same soil, for a new set of masters who had never called it sacred at all. The gods lost their bean in 1521. Spain had just discovered a new kind of empire, one measured in ledgers instead of altars, and it was hungry for exactly this kind of harvest. Chocolate crossed the Atlantic and, for nearly a century, Spain guarded the secret like a state treasure. Sugar was added, monasteries took up the brewing, and the drink spread quietly through Spanish courts before the rest of Europe even knew it existed. Then the argument started all over again, this time inside the Catholic Church. For more than 100 years, priests and scholars argued in earnest over whether drinking chocolate broke a religious fast. Was it food, which was forbidden, or drink, which was allowed? A Spanish colonial historian named Antonio de León Pinelo wrote an entire book on the question in 1636, and even he couldn't settle it one way or the other. It took until 1662 for Pope Alexander VII to end the debate with a single ruling. Liquids do not break a fast. Chocolate, officially, was safe on holy days. By then, it was already becoming something else entirely, an industry. In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Coenraad van Houten patented a hydraulic press that squeezed most of the fat out of roasted cacao, leaving a cake that could be ground into fine, workable powder. In 1847, the English firm Fry & Sons used that innovation to press cocoa butter back into cocoa solids and sugar, creating the first solid chocolate bar. In 1875, Daniel Peter and Henri Nestlé folded in powdered milk and invented milk chocolate. A drink that had once required royal permission to taste was, within 2 generations, sitting on a shelf. That kind of demand needed more cacao than the Americas alone could grow. In 1822, Portugal transplanted cacao trees to a small colonial island off West Africa called São Tomé, worked first by enslaved labor, and then, after slavery was formally outlawed, by so-called contract laborers who were never actually free to leave. In 1905, the British journalist Henry Nevinson travelled there and called it exactly what it was: slavery, wearing a new name. On some of the plantations he visited, more than 1 in 10 newly arrived labourers died within their first year. It took the Cadbury Company, which bought nearly half its cocoa from those very plantations, 3 more years to admit what its own investigator had already confirmed. Cadbury, Fry's, and Rowntree only stopped buying São Tomé cocoa in 1909. By then, Cacao had already put down new roots nearby. A Ghanaian blacksmith named Teta Kwashi brought cacao pods home from a neighbouring island in 1879 and planted them in the Gold Coast. In French-controlled Ivory Coast, colonial administrators forced farmers into growing cacao for export through taxes they had no other way to pay. The industry that would one day promise, in 2001, to end child labour had, by the start of the 20th century, already been caught looking away from forced labour once. Today, Ghana and Ivory Coast grow roughly 60% of the world's cocoa, feeding a chocolate industry worth more than $100 billion a year. Farmers in Ivory Coast earn, on average, well under $1 a day. In Ghana, about $1. Some have never once tasted the finished chocolate their beans become. In 2020, the most rigorous study ever conducted on the subject, commissioned by the United States Department of Labor, found roughly 1.5 million children working in cocoa production across those 2 countries. Of those, 95% were doing work classified as hazardous: swinging machetes, clearing land, handling agricultural chemicals meant for adults. The 2005 deadline came and went. So did 2008. So did 2010. The industry quietly scaled its own promise down to a 70% reduction by 2020, missed that too, and pushed the new target to 2025. In 2021, the United States Supreme Court dismissed a case brought by 6 men from Mali who said they had been trafficked as children, some as young as 12, onto Ivorian cocoa farms. The court did not rule that it hadn't happened. It ruled on a technicality about where exactly the decision to look away had legally taken place. And here is the twist nobody sees coming. In December of 2024, the price of cocoa hit an all-time high, nearly $12,000 a metric ton, up more than 180% in a single year. Cacao had become so valuable that in March of 2026, thieves stole an entire truckload of it in finished form. Over 413,000 Kit Kat bars, roughly 12 tons, vanishing en route from a factory in Italy to a distributor in Poland. Investigators traced each bar by its individual batch number, the way you would track stolen electronics, not candy. A bean once valuable enough to buy a human life is today valuable enough to steal by the truckload. The children who grow it still cannot afford to buy it back. Trace the whole arc in a breath. Fruit rotting on an Amazon riverbank, sucked from the pulp by people who had no idea what they were starting. A bean so sacred that gods bled onto it, and men died drinking it in its honor. An empire that built its money, its class system, and its religion around it, and fell in 2 years to a stranger who thought it tasted like nothing worth keeping. A colonial trade that crossed an ocean, argued with a pope for a century, got pressed into powder, folded into milk, and became the first industrial candy on earth. A slavery scandal in West Africa that a chocolate company knew about and sat on for years before it finally acted. And then, a century later, the very same shape appearing again. A promise, a deadline, a broken deadline, 1.5 million children, and consequences that have never quite landed on anyone at all. At the start of this story, it might have felt like two different subjects stitched together. An ancient civilization's strange bloody rituals safely behind glass and a modern supply chain problem safely in the news. They were never two subjects. They are the same one, still running. The Aztecs and the Maya called this plant the food of the gods and fed it blood to keep the offering complete. Nobody calls it that anymore. But it is still being paid for in somebody else's blood and somebody else's childhood. Only now there is no altar to make the transaction feel sacred, no God to answer for it, just a shelf in a store, and a company that signed a promise 25 years ago it still has not kept. If any part of this surprised you, the cacao and blood, the Kit Kat heist, the deadline broken 5 separate times, tell us which one in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, the kind that don't stop at the sweet part, subscribe. There's more where this came from.